Understanding the signaling pathways and factors underlying the aging process has been of significant global scientific and medical interest, as they shed insight into the diseases of aging and healthy longevity. In this session, our distinguished experts discuss the latest trends in aging research and translating scientific insights to therapeutics as well as health solutions. Please welcome Linda Partridge, Founding Director, Max Planck Institute for Biology of Aging, Professor, Institute of Healthy Aging and GEE, UCL. Eric Verdin, CEO and President, Buck Institute for Research on Aging, and Session Leader, Sebastian Thualt, Chief Editor, Nature Aging.
Good morning, good afternoon, and good evening, everyone. Thank you for joining us today for this panel discussion on the state of aging research. My name is Sebastian Thualt. I'm the Chief Editor of Nature Aging, a journal publishing biological health and social science research and opinion pieces on aging and age-related diseases. It's my great pleasure to introduce our two panelists, who are both prominent researchers in the field of aging, Dr. Linda Partridge from the Max Planck Institute for Biology of Aging in Germany, and Dr. Eric Verdin from the Buck Institute in the United States. Linda and Eric, welcome.
Thank you.
Welcome.
Sebastian.
Good to see you.
Yeah.
So as an introduction to this session, I want to say a few words about why research on aging and longevity is so important. So owing to the progress of modern medicine, many of us are now leading much longer lives than a century ago, and population across the globe are getting older. And for the first time in human history, there are more people over the age of 65 than children under the age of 5. And it is estimated that by 2050, about 20% of the world's population will be over the age of 65. And such population aging comes with both challenges and opportunities. And for those who remain healthy, opportunities include, for instance, continuing to work and share knowledge, volunteering, caring for family, sharing wealth, and contributing to society in many other ways. But good health is a requirement to realize those opportunities, and unfortunately, longer lives are not necessarily lived in good health. Most older adults live with multiple diseases such as cancer, cardiovascular or metabolic disorders, dementia, arthritis, and so on. And so this age-associated multimorbidity leads to important health, economic, and social challenges. Therefore, achieving healthy aging should be a priority for our society. It is a grand challenge that we must solve to access the so-called longevity dividend. And it is clear that a better understanding of the biology of aging will help us improve human health span, or as some would say, adding life to years. So with that, I'd like to ask my first question to the panel. So Linda and Eric, biologically speaking, what is aging and what underlies aging at the biological level? Linda, would you like to start with this question?
Very good question. So I think it's become pretty clear in recent years what the main culprits are in the aging process. So it probably kicks off with things going wrong at the genetic level, damage to DNA and so on, so that the whole machinery that controls gene expression starts to deteriorate. And that means also that proteins start to suffer in cells, and that the control of protein quality is often affected. The powerhouses of the cells, the mitochondria, become dysfunctional. Senescent cells start to accumulate. These have turned out to be very important in the aging process. They're cells that are resistant to cell death, but very biologically active, and they cause tissue damage. Stem cells start to misfunction, so they don't divide when they should, or they divide when they shouldn't and give rise to the wrong sort of progeny. And there's a systemic inflammation that builds up during aging, so that the whole circulating environment deteriorates. And also cells become really bad at responding to the normal nutrient and signaling cues that circulate in the systemic environment. So it's complicated. There's a lot of stuff going on, and it's not independent. So for instance, genetic damage can cause cell senescence, which contributes to this age-related inflammation that seems to occur in most animals during aging. But it's clear now that we can combat some of those basic mechanisms of aging. So identifying them has been very important on the road to improving health during aging.
So Eric, would you like to add anything to this and perhaps say a few words about what are the implications of this biology for age-related diseases?
Yes. So one of the things that has emerged in the last 10 to 15 years, and which was not expected, is the idea that when we study the basic mechanism of aging, not only are we able to make animals, various models, live longer, but they also live healthier. And so this really has brought up the idea that aging is just not a process that sort of limits your lifespan. It also contributes to a concept that we call the health span. And so the realization that the mechanism underlying the aging process are the same that actually drive disease process during aging really has changed the way we think about our field. So this whole concept has been called geroscience. It's the idea that aging is the major risk factor for a whole series of chronic diseases. We're actually living through an epidemic of these diseases as the population age. So there are incredibly important sort of societal and scientific implications of this work, which means that as we now consider translating all of this basic biology into humans, one of the early focus is really to try to apply the science of aging and tinker with the pathways that we've identified that regulate the aging process, with the hope that we will alleviate or suppress the development of these chronic disease of aging. And Sebastian, you mentioned these at the onset, chronic diseases that we're all familiar with, such as Alzheimer's disease, Parkinson's, cardiovascular disease, heart attack, stroke, many forms of cancer, which actually are burdening our society and really limiting the quality of life in late years. And so a lot of the focus of our work is really right now to try to combat these diseases and change the way we perceive the aging process.
Great.
Yeah. And it's very clear that these underlying mechanisms of aging are present in the etiology of these age-related diseases. They really are major contributors. And if we could tackle them, we could probably prevent multiple diseases simultaneously.
Yeah, I think that's a very interesting concept. So aging research, in my opinion, is really a booming field. There are important new discoveries being published weekly. And so I wanted to ask you if you could tell us about some of those discoveries that have caught your attention recently and that perhaps illustrate some of the current trends in the field.
It's a really active field at the moment. It's wonderful that almost every day something really interesting turns up in the literature. I started out my own scientific career actually as an evolutionary biologist. And I'm very interested in these creatures that live a very long time out there in nature. I mean, that's where the really big lifespans are. So it was recently discovered, for instance, that the Greenland shark can live for 400 years. Absolutely amazing. And the little bivalve, the ocean quahoog that lives on the floor of the Atlantic Ocean, can live 500 years. So there are some immense lifespans out there. And people have been very interested in trying to find out what are the underlying causes of that very slow rate of aging? And can we learn things from these creatures that might help us improve human health at the end of life? And I think one paper that really caught my eye recently was about rockfishes, because it turns out there are lots of species of rockfish, and some of them can live up to 200 years. Whereas some live only 2 years. So we've clearly got these big genetic differences in the rate of aging and the resulting lifespan. And what the paper that I'm talking about did was to sequence the genome of all these rockfishes to try to figure out, first of all, the evolutionary tree of all these species, how are they related to each other, and had the long lifespans that occur in some species all evolved in just one bit of the tree or independently in the different branches. And it turned out the latter was true. They got lots of independent evolutionary transitions to really long lives. So that meant that they'd got replicated examples of what you need to do to achieve a long life. And there was some ecological stuff there. So it turned out that the long-lived species, for instance, tend to live at depth. And they also have a big body size at first breeding. So quite a bit of the genetic variation was to do with those things. But once they were factored out, really interestingly, from my point of view, it turned out that the nutrient sensing network, the insulin, IGF, TOR, which has turned out to be so important experimentally in the lab, genes involved in that network were clearly evolving in these long-lived species. And there was also a signature from expansion of genes involved in inflammation, and very clear in both cases. So in some ways, what the paper did was very encouraging. It suggested that with our lab work, with the laboratory model organisms, the yeast and the worm and the fly, that actually we're capturing the basic mechanisms because they were already known about. And it turns out now that they're important in the evolution of long lives in nature. Mm-hmm. And then on the inflammation theme, there's been a great paper recently.
Is that okay? Just I wanted to add a comment. Actually, the journal published a paper recently looking at genetic factors that influence longevity in centenarians. And just like you mentioned, some of the insulin pathways and all the biology we know from model organisms, did show up in those analyses. So it seems that, this biology actually is translational and applies to human population.
I think in that way, the field is maturing. It's becoming very clear, I think, what we have to target to improve human health at older ages. I think that really has itself come of age in recent years. And it's clear that inflammation is a huge player. And another paper that I really liked recently looked into the mechanisms that are causing this innate immunity to overreact during aging. And they could show basically that the metabolism in macrophages goes wrong. They become increasingly reliant on glucose, but they also increase expression of a receptor that causes sequestration of glucose into glycogen, so it becomes unavailable for glycolysis or respiration. And they were able genetically and pharmacologically to inhibit this receptor and show that they could turn the macrophages into a better respiratory state with a good energy supply. They became less pro-inflammatory. And terribly importantly, they could decrease brain inflammation, which is so important in neurodegenerative disease. And even in old mice where that inflammation in the brain had started, if they administered this pharmacological inhibitor, they could restore spatial memory and long-term potentiation in the hippocampus. So really quite a remarkable study.
Yeah, really interesting. What about you, Eric? What have you seen recently that caught your attention?
I want to echo what Linda just mentioned. I think inflammation, chronic inflammation, is really emerging as one of the major players, and that's one topic that had been somewhat ignored. I mean, it was, for example, not included in the original 9 hallmarks of aging. And I think it seems that the field now is really discovering the importance of inflammation. And one of the papers that highlights this in a critical way is a recent paper by Laura Niederhofer and her colleagues at the University of Minnesota, where they knocked out a gene that encodes a DNA repair protein, the RCC1, and they did this in a tissue-specific manner. They knocked it out in all hematopoietic cells. So these are the cells located in the bone marrow that generates pretty much all blood cells, macrophages, neutrophils, and lymphocytes. And what they were able to do with this selective knockout of DNA repair mechanism in these cells is to induce an accelerated process of senescence in the whole lymphoid and myeloid system. And what they observed is that this actually shortened the lifespan, showing that just senescence in the immune system itself becomes dominant. And what was perhaps even more interesting is the observation that they observed secondary senescence in multiple organs, indicating that the presence of the senescent myeloid and lymphoid cells circulating in these organs was able to induce a secondary set of senescence in those tissues. And so this really points to it doesn't prove that chronic inflammation is the only mechanism, but it certainly points to the fact that once you have senescence in that compartment, it can become dominant across the whole organism, and therefore represents a really likely important target. Another paper that I wanted to highlight is also from the University of Minnesota, from Paul Robinson's lab, and it relates to COVID-19, which is actually quite exciting because we've all seen what has happened during the last 2 years is that age is the major risk factor for the complications of after COVID-19 infection. And it turns out that the aging mechanism actually are responsible. And what in that paper, what they were able to show is that using a mouse model of a coronavirus, not SARS-CoV-2, but another mouse-specific coronavirus, they were able to show that under normal condition, when you infect an old mouse, you actually have close to 100% mortality with this virus. What they did is they treated these old mice with senolytics, or they deleted the senescent cells using a variety of genetic tricks. And they were able to show that just doing this actually completely changed the course of the disease and really actually allowed a very significant fraction of the mice to survive. And obviously, the implications for this are that in the human population, this could be, doesn't prove, but it could be one of the mechanisms that underlies their increased susceptibility to a bad outcome. Now, what's interesting also in the human population, when you look at risk factors for COVID-19, it's not only old age, but it's also what we call pre-existing condition, which are, again, many of them are these chronic conditions associated with aging, highlighting the fact that your age obviously is a big risk factor, but if you have other age-related type of disease, you are also at increased risk, and obesity is certainly one of the major one. Now, the implication of this work is incredibly important because we are in the middle of this pandemic, but also if we look back at influenza, the flu, is exactly the same picture. And so we spent some time actually going back to the literature. There's a direct correlation between your age and your risk factor for influenza. And I'll remind you that close to 40 to 50,000 people die every year still to this day from influenza. Finally, the last implication of this is that we know that vaccination rates decrease directly as a function of age, which means that the people who already are at the highest risk are the ones who are likely to respond the least to our vaccines. And so there's therefore a lot of interest, and this is an area that we invest in very heavily, of trying to understand how aging mechanism could actually modulate your ability to respond to a vaccine, and to bring all of the science of aging, the interventions that we will be discussing later, to try to mitigate the poor response to vaccination that we see in the older population.
I think this is a fantastic set of examples, very interesting research, and clearly, some of the implications are readily apparent. So in that context, actually, where do you think we stand with regard to the translation of this abundance of biological knowledge to essentially improving human health span? Are there successes in such translational efforts already out there? Are there challenges, and what are these?
I think one of the big challenges with us is that we live so long. So we know now what the things are that go wrong during aging from the animal studies. And we also know that we can intervene in them with pharmacological treatments, metabolites, genetic manipulations, lifestyle, including nutrition. So we know the basics there, but to translate that to humans, really what we need very badly, and what a lot of people are working on quite successfully, is good biomarkers. So we need something that will tell us if we try a new drug with humans, are they responding in a way that suggests that we're hitting the target and that we're going to keep them healthier later in their lives when they're at risk of age-related diseases. So people are looking very hard at, for instance, DNA methylation, modification of histone proteins, circulating metabolites, RNA transcripts, other protein markers, inflammatory markers, to try to get a picture of where people are sitting in the aging process. So, of course, one of the things about the aging process is it's very individually variable. Different things go wrong in different individuals, and different organs are affected during aging. So what we really need is a shortcut way of seeing where this person is sitting in the various things that can go wrong during aging, and whether a particular intervention is improving matters or not. So I think there's a lot of very interesting work going on there on so-called aging clocks, and what slows them down and what speeds them up, which I think is going to be very, very helpful. And this is the kind of information we really need. I think a lot of the pharmacological interventions at the moment tend to be of the nature of changing the indication of existing drugs. It's going to be very difficult, for instance, to do a large population scale trial on a new drug with aging as the indication, even though the FDA now do recognize aging as a valid outcome for clinical trials. It would just be extremely expensive. So quite a lot of the work that's going on is saying, well, we've got drugs already that target the nutrient sensing network, that can improve mitochondrial function and so on. Let's have a look at them and whether they could be repurposed to prevent diseases when we know that those features of aging are present in the etiology. And I think for the new drugs, it's going to probably be very tailored against specific indications. For instance, the senolytic drugs, which Eric's already mentioned and which I think are going to be incredibly important. They can be quite toxic if used systemically, but applied to a particular compartment in the body, like the eye or a joint, they may be a lot more safe and effective to be used. So I think that those are the challenges, but also ones where huge progress is being made at the moment.
So exciting. What about you, Eric?
Yeah, I think I agree with Linda. We live in extraordinary times in terms of this field of research. If you look, there's typically a 15 to 20 year gap between major discoveries and their, sort of implementation in the clinic. And what's quite interesting is aging as an indication is bringing a whole series of challenges that we have not had to deal with. As drug developers. One of the things that, went to medical school, and one of the first things that I was taught was when you take the Hippocratic Oath is first do no harm. And which means there's going to be a very significant barrier of care and making sure that whatever interventions we actually implement in the aging population is not doing harm. And we know that many drugs have that potential, unfortunately, especially if we consider giving drugs to people for a long time. So that really has pushed the field in multiple directions. And I would say there's a lack of clarity right now because we're not quite sure how this will play out. It's clear that there's a changing of attitude with regards to aging as a disease, or as something that can be treated by itself. And I think a good example of this is the TAME trial that Nir Barzilai and his colleague are proposing to conduct, which would give metformin to normal adult and assess their ability to resist during a kind of limited period of time.
This is an example of repurposing that, like Linda was talking about, since metformin is a drug for diabetes.
Exactly.
So metformin, of course, is a very, very safe drug.
Yes, and it's, there are hundreds of millions of doses that have been given. It is a safe drug. We have epidemiological data suggesting that people on diabetics on metformin actually are protected against the development of further development of type 2 diabetes, some cancer, neurodegeneration, and so on. So metformin looks like an anti-aging drug, which it has not been proven to be an anti-aging drug in a non-diabetic population. This is why this trial is really important. So that's one way to look at the development of these drugs. The other way is to really identify specific conditions that are linked to aging that have not been addressed or even recognized in the past. And I think there are a few of those that actually could probably form a faster path to drug development. I'll give you a few examples. One is sarcopenia, a loss of muscle mass associated with aging. Another one is thymic involution, is the loss of the thymic gland behind your sternum, which is a key organ in lymphoid in T cell development, which is actually lost during aging. Another example is lack of vaccination that we were talking about earlier. I think many of these actually are being targeted individually. And finally, Melinda mentioned, eye disease, macular degeneration, glaucoma are diseases for which we know targeting senescent cells seems to be having a therapeutic potential. So I think right now, the biotech companies in the space are exploring these different avenues, and we will see. I think I hope that we're quite far from the idea of giving a pill to everyone, hoping to delay their aging. But we're quite close to the idea that people who are at increased risk or who are already manifesting some acute development of some of these manifestations of aging will be targeted, but with specific medicine. And I hope that we also will have a chance in a few minutes, Sebastian, to talk about lifestyle modification, which I think should not be forgotten, because that's certainly the first line of evidence in delaying aging.
And I think, the efforts you mentioned, are really pioneering efforts of translation. I think it's going to be very interesting to see what's going to emerge from this. So as you said, Eric, so far we've mostly focused this conversation on the biological knowledge that could help us slow down the aging process. But we already know that certain lifestyle choices can lead to healthy aging and longevity and help address some of the population aging challenges. So yes, let's talk a little bit about those.
Well, I think we all know, don't we? I mean, the two crucial things are exercise and diet. And I mean, they can improve health at any age, depending what situation people are starting from. And the huge, inequalities in health during aging that exist in many modern societies are often down to problems with those two very simple things, and others such as smoking and so on. But, decent weight control, so to avoid metabolic disease complications, and exercise to maintain, cardiac fitness and prevent sarcopenia and so on. These are very, very simple and effective interventions, but they're ones that certainly in the countries I'm really familiar with are not standard public health measures at all. They're really only dealt with in the context of obesity rather than aging. It would be such a simple intervention to have, regular dance classes for older people. People love dancing at any age, and it's fantastic exercise and so cheap and simple. But hardly any countries outside the East Asian countries actually take those sort of interventions really seriously, and they should.
I agree with this, and I'll give you a couple of examples that are, I think, further amplifying the point that you're making, Linda. One thing that most people do not realize is the importance of lifestyle and their own life expectancy. There's, many people have a rather fatalistic sort of outlook in terms of what will happen to them. There was a recent paper from the Calico group looking at the relative contribution of genetics versus lifestyle factors. And while we might argue on all of the merits of this paper, I think one of the signal that came out of their analysis was that close to 90% of your life expectancy appears to be determined by environmental factors, lifestyle or so. And I think this to me was a really incredibly powerful signal for people to know that mostly it's on you. You can't blame your parents essentially for the problems that you will have, although there are some genetic effects, but it's still predominantly lifestyle effects. And knowing this, we know also from epidemiological data and also from looking at our societies where we have already incredible discrepancies in terms of life expectancy. Within the same cities, sometimes in the US and in Europe as well, you can have the poorest of the people living on average to 67 and the richest or the most educated, more affluent living up to 87. So there's a 20-year gap there of life expectancy. Now, we know many of the factors that contribute to these differences. I mean, a strong one that I'm convinced is education, is really providing people with the valid information. Others are, of course, physical activity. I don't like to use the term exercise. I think physical activity simply is already key. Nutrition is a huge one, and that ties in very much with what we know about the biology of aging. Stress and sleep. So those are 4 areas that I think everyone who is considering trying to maximize their lifespan should be considering. Finally, an example in terms of where I think our field of research could still contribute a lot, because I make the case that the drugs that will slow down the aging process are being developed and they will become available. But what can you do today to actually be in the best position possible when the drugs are going to become available, is to really focus on these points. A good example is exercise or physical activity. Again, we see a lot of sort of lack of knowledge in the population in terms of what should they do. People think, I have to go to the gym, I have to sweat, I don't like any of these things, therefore I will not do any things. And we know, for example, that just walking is an amazing anti-aging medicine. That's probably the best that we have today. Someone has argued that if you could put it in a pill, it would be a $20 billion molecule in comparison to the value of other medicines that we have. And even when we think about walking, a lot of people think, well, I have to go walk, for an hour and a half, do 10,000 steps. Well, a study was just published not so long ago looking at, how many steps, the influence of the number of steps that you're walking and your life expectancy. And the remarkable finding out of that study was that close to 70% of the effect of physical activity is obtained when you've walked 4,700 steps, which is about 25 minutes. And I would argue that this should be part of a very broad public policy effort, as Linda mentioned. And I'm sometimes really puzzled by the fact that we have this huge investment in healthcare and we spend very little on prevention, which I think hopefully our field will really bring back to the fore to let the people who decide these things that this is the cheapest bang for your buck.
Yeah,
so to speak.
I agree. I mean, there's certainly a need for promoting those policies and improving public health with the things we already know work. So that's so important. I think we are reaching the end of our session. I want to thank you both for this interesting conversation. I think this is a very exciting time for the field, and we can see how this research has so many ramifications, not only in terms of our understanding of the biological fundamentals, but also with an impact in the clinical and societal spheres. And so investing in aging research is about investing in our future selves and in future generations. And I really look forward to witnessing the continued growth of this field. Thanks again, everyone.
Thank you for having us.